Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Maham Jyoti Gamaya Mrityurmam Amritam Gamaya Avir Avir Maedhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukham Te Namaham Pahinityam. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves. And evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is the mark of madness. And we're going to be talking about madness as a metaphor for the plight of the jiva, that is the embodied soul, who, under the influence of Maya, has lost touch with reality and who suffers in this world of samsara. There's an old Jewish legend about a king who discovered that the entire supply of grain for the kingdom had been contaminated by a strange fungus. The grain looked the same, it tasted the same, but anyone who ate it would lose their mind. They'd lose touch with reality, and they would go mad. Now, only the king and his advisor were the only ones who knew about this. And, well, they only had 2 more days supply left of the normal uncontaminated grain. And after that, what were they going to do? Because without the grain, the people would starve. That was their main food supply. And there wouldn't be any more new grain available for at least another year. And they weren't sure that at that time that also wouldn't be contaminated. So together they discussed this problem, and they decided that they would have to feed the grain, release it after 2 days to feed the people. But that the king and the advisor themselves would not eat. That would mean that at least they would have 2 sane people left in the kingdom. But then the king thought, wait a minute, that's not really going to work. Because if everyone eats the grain and is kind of living in a different reality, then how am I going to govern them? I won't know what they're thinking. No, I'm going to have to eat the grain also. And then he instructed the minister, saying, you alone we need one person. We need at least one person who remains sane, so you will not eat. And then the advisor thought, no, wait a minute, that's not going to work either, because if you expect expect me to advise you, that is a king. How can an advisor give advice to a king who wouldn't even listen to him? He wouldn't even understand what he was talking about. And so they concluded that that wouldn't work either, and that they would both eat the grain. And so they did. Well, they had a plan. The plan was the king ordered that all the people in the kingdom on the very next day were to put an indelible mark on their forehead. And every morning, it was the royal mandate that they were to go to the mirror in their house, and they were look in that mirror, and they were to ask themselves, what does this mark mean? Why are we doing this? Why am I here doing this? And the kings, their hopes were that somewhere along the line, that asking such questions, that someone would get an insight into the problem or what had happened and would maybe figure out a way to cure the problem. Well, that's the end of the story as it comes down to us. But of course, the story is not finished because we're still living that same story today. And each one of us has within ourselves an invisible mark that somehow prompts us to ask these universal philosophical questions. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Who am I? What's the point? So I kind of like this story as asking some of the great philosophical questions about life. Now, in the story, the cause of the madness was the contaminated grain. Now, there are a lot of different causes of mental derangement. American Indians, for example, were commonly thought such a person who acted in some strange, peculiar way may very well be inhabited by a spirit from another world. And thus they regarded such persons often with awe and reverence. And certainly we know in the medieval period in Europe, it was a common understanding, belief in demonic possession, and that lunatics may well be possessed by devils. And in fact, even today, the Roman Catholic Church authorizes official exorcisms of demons in certain cases. But in the modern period, of course, we know that any cases of madness probably due to some genetic, biological, chemical imbalance, probably psychological in nature. Vedanta philosophy tells us that, well, maybe it's even deeper. Maybe it's like a universal problem. And the root is, at the root is metaphysical. Let's look here at in common parlance, we think about a person who is mad. Well, how would we know if they're sane or they're insane? Well, probably we would ask them to go to a psychologist or to a psychiatrist, and maybe the doctor would look in his diagnostic manual, and he would make a determination We know generally, we can say, what is a sane person? Well, a sane person is a person who is in good mental health. And the word health, of course, comes from the old Latin root there, which means health, healthy, whole, complete, holistic. That means hale and hearty. A person whose mind is not fragmented. It's not he's a person of sound mind. So that's the word. That's whole. And if he's a person of very healthy, sound mind, we would say he's a holy person. He has good mental health. That is, what is a normal person? A sane person is a normal person. That is, he behaves very well in society. In his mind, he's rational, he's reasonable, and he is basically lives in a manner that we would say he is in touch with reality. We can contrast such a person with a person who's the opposite. The sane and the insane would be that would be a person who was out of touch with reality, a person whose mind was fragmented and not functioning as a whole and a complete healthy mind, a person who did not behave properly. He didn't behave well in society. And, well, we can see that that kind of a diagnosis we can see raises some interesting ambiguous words like what is normal and what is rational and what is reality. After all, we could say probably that no one is completely normal or is completely all the time rational or is always living in touch with reality. What is reality? Certainly we know, for example, that every day and every night a person may become very angry. And we may say, at least for that short temporarily, people say he's mad. And he's kind of lost his reason. Every night, we fall asleep, we walk through the looking glass into a dream world. And there, in that dream world, we pass 6 or 8 hours wandering through. Maybe we're having tea with the March Hare and the Mad Hatter. And unlike Alice, you see, Alice at least always was wondering, and she thought that she was in Wonderland. That is, she was stunned and amazed at what was going on. She always questioning what was going on. But we never, ordinary people, we never question it. We take it to be completely normal. And so we pass that time. It's only in retrospect the next day that we find, in fact, that our life, therefore, that time was in a completely illogical, irrational behavior patterns. So it is with individuals. Well, that's maybe we can say temporarily. We lose touch with reason. It happens in the case of individuals, and it happens in the case of whole societies. We had a book, I remember, in our monastery in San Francisco. The title of that book was Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. That's the title. And so many historical accounts of things such as we can imagine the Nazi Germany, and we can imagine during the regime during the Stalinist era in communist Russia, where dissidents were either sent to the concentration camps in the Gulag Archipelago. If they were intellectuals, however, they were sent to psychiatrists, and they were diagnosed as mad, and they too were sent to the Gulag, but they were sent to official sanatoriums, to where they fared almost as well. That was under the system of Stalinist regime, we could say, a kind of a universal collective craziness. Maybe some of you remember the story by Edgar Allan Poe. The title is, there also he talks about the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. Speaks to our topic this morning. There was once 1845, 19th century. Young man was a young medical student riding his horse through the country, going back to the city of Paris, passed by an old chateau, which was now being used as a famous private sanatorium. And they had in that place instituted a whole new system of treating mental patients. It was called the soothing system. And the patients were allowed just to walk freely and to come and go as they please on the grounds, and the doctors and the nurses would talk to them as normal people. And that system had been adopted in other sanatoriums around in France. And so the student thought, yes, I think I'll stop, pay them a visit. I'd like to see that for myself. And so he knocked on the door, and the supervisor answered the door. Yes, I'd like to, could you show me around? I'm interested in your system here. Oh, yes, said the supervisor, please. But you know, it's just dinner time. Please come in and share with us a glass of wine and dine with us together. So they went together into the dining hall. A little peculiar, the dining hall. All the windows were boarded up. They locked the doors when they came in. But there, the student, he saw the whole table filled with all this food, and the big chairs lined up. That is all the doctors and the nurses and the keepers would dine together. He sat down, and there they brought the pièce de résistance. That is the special dish. He put down brasseau au chat. The student looked at it. He thought it looked like a big house cat with an apple in his mouth. He thought, that's peculiar. I don't think I'll take any of that. So they had a glass of wine. And they began talking. Everyone seemed to be very pleasant, but occasionally people acted kind of odd. Certain of the doctors and nurses had idiosyncrasies. Why, Dr. Tar, sitting right across from him, occasionally would pop his cheek like a champagne bottle, and he would fizz like a bottle of champagne. And Madame Leroux, seated right next to him, why, she would be in the midst of a sentence talking. She would start to flap her arms like a chicken, and she would cluck like a chicken. And Professor Feather, who was sitting next to that student, occasionally he would scoot out his chair. He would stand up and he'd kick back his heels like he was like a donkey. And down the table, another one of the keepers, occasionally he would croak like a frog. And one of the nurses, she she'd get up and she'd turn round and round, spinning like a top. And the students, seeing all this, was wondering, and then they heard some yells and some cries coming from downstairs, down below in the cellars, some shouts and some screams and some yells. And the student asked the keeper, said, the superintendent, what is that? He said, oh, well, you see, those are the patients. Oh, said the student. He said, well, I thought that there was the patients were not confined, that there was no punishment, that's part of the soothing system. Well, no, you see, we had to change the system, said the superintendent. We had problems. The patients began to misbehave, and we had to confine them. And then once they broke out of their confinement and they ran through the whole chateau, doing damage, and so Dr. Tarr and Professor Feather here, they had to devise a system of punishment. And it's worked very well. So far, it's worked very well. So don't worry about it. Everything is now functioning, but again they heard the cries, again the yells, again the shouts, only this time it seemed like they were much louder. In fact, it seemed like they were coming towards the dining room, and sure enough, it sounds like there's pounding at the windows. The boarded up windows were being broken down. And who's to come through? They broke through those boarded up windows, and sure, and through those windows, there came what appeared to be a troop of black, hairy chimpanzees. Well, of course, they were the doctors and the nurses and the keepers who had been tarred and feathered and who were being kept confined in the cellars beneath. And a great confusion ensued. So that's the story by Edgar Allan Poe. It seems like in the asylum that the lunatics had taken control of the asylum. Sri Ramakrishna says, this world is a great lunatic asylum in which all men are mad. Some men are mad, I'm quoting to you from Swami Vivekananda's discussion here. All men are mad. Some are mad for women. Some are mad for gold, and others are mad for name and fame. Some few are mad for God. And I am mad for God, as Sri Ramakrishna is speaking here. So I'm mad for God. It's true sometimes. When we read the lives of saints, I'm thinking maybe of like the lives of the desert fathers. You'll see that oftentimes we find that the stories seem to be very bizarre and very strange. Not always, but they carried it to such extremes that we would consider it to be maybe irrational, and yet they were great saints. And Sri Ramakrishna is saying, well, we know when we read in the lives of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, several of his the young boys who were coming to him as at that time, some of whom lived near the village of Dakshineshwar. They came once, and they had a wonderful experience in the presence of Sri Ramakrishna. But then we read that they didn't come again for another 10 days. And we wonder, well, why is that? Why do you think they would immediately come back every day? No, problem is that their parents, they were disallowed by their parents. Parents considered the priest of Dakshineshwar to be a bad influence on of course, this was at the very beginning of the story, on young people. And so it was difficult for them they were discouraged by their parents from visiting even Sri Ramakrishna. Well, Sri Ramakrishna says on several occasions there, I went mad. And we know, too, that on one occasion, a great knower of God, that is a great Brahmagyani, came to Dakshineshwar as a wandering sadhu. And he was a jnani. But he looked very peculiar. He carried in one hand a potted mango plant, and the other just a bamboo stick, and he wore tattered clothes, tattered shoes, and he didn't observe any of the rules of the temple. Came into the compound, walked through the river Ganges, took his bath in the Ganges, and then dripping wet, came back into the temple. And people were shocked, and they were frightened of what is this madman coming into the temple. And then he began to chant, and he began to sing a song to the Divine Mother. And the whole temple began to shake and began to tremble, and everyone ran out, or they were terrified. And Haladhari, who was the pujari, he was stunned and amazed to see the whole temple in sense of vibration. The jnani finished his hymn to the Divine Mother. Then he went out, and he went to one of the kitchens of the Dakshineshwar to get some food. In Dakshineshwar, they had two kitchens where they would feed wandering sadhus and the homeless. But as soon as they saw him standing waiting for some food, immediately guards came and asked him to leave. He was told to leave, that he was such a disreputable-looking person. No problem. No problem for the jnani. He walked around behind the kitchens, and there was all the rubbish heap where they threw the leaf plates and all the crumbs and the trash. And dogs were eating from the plates, and he just walked over there. He pushed the dogs away, and he began to eat the crumbs from the plates himself. And Haladhari, meanwhile, the temple priest, he had run to Sri Ramakrishna, reporting to Ramakrishna what had happened. Ramakrishna almost passed out hearing this. He said, "Oh, Mother, was this going to happen to me?" And then together, they went to see the jnani. And they asked him questions, and he replied in perfectly reasonable tone. He gave them wonderful spiritual instruction. Haladhari asked him, he says, "Are you a Purna Jnani? That is a man of perfect knowledge?" He said, "Yes, I am." And so saying, he finished what he left at Dakshineshwar temple, and Haladhari followed him for a long way, asking him wanted to get some more advice about how to know God. Finally, he stopped. The Purna Jnani, he stopped. He pointed down to the dirty ditch water by the road. He said, "Yes, when you can see the pure water of the Ganges is the same as this dirty ditch water, when they're to you the same. That is, when you've achieved that state of same-sightedness, then you will have achieved perfect knowledge." So that was the Purna Jnani. Was he mad? No, he wasn't mad. You can't be, that is a saint, can't be mad, because the whole word saint comes from the Latin base, what we call, what we get the word sane is sanitation, that is of cleansed, physically cleansed and mentally cleansed of all sin. That's a saint. A saint is a sanctified person, and who's achieved supreme sanity. But sometimes these knowers of God, they behave like that. But on the other hand, yes. But Sri Ramakrishna says, though, he says this world is, he says all men are mad. What he means here is all ordinary men. All ordinary men are mad. Well, it may seem to us like, well, isn't that kind of like an overstatement? Isn't that kind of a little bit of exaggeration? And yet we know very well that as we begin to do spiritual practice, well, anyone who has ever sat for meditation, for example, has encountered the monkey mind. And we know that a monkey is naturally restless. And certainly if that monkey were to drink a bottle of wine, he would become drunken and even more jumping up and down and restless, a monkey swinging from branch to branch and screeching and chattering. And then maybe he would be also stung by a scorpion. He would even more screechy, even more terrified, even more crazy. He would jump around and he would go over and swing down from the trees. Maybe he would go over and stumble on to standing on a hot iron plate. He was picking one night, dancing on that plate. And then maybe imagine that a demon entered into him. He would still be jumping. How crazy that monkey would be. Well, similar it is with us. Maybe we don't notice it until we begin to sit quietly and begin to encounter our minds. And we know that our minds are like are as restless as a monkey, and that we ourselves are like that restless monkey, drunk with the wine of desire, stung by the scorpion of jealousy, dancing up and down, get our footing on a hot iron plate of the world. Demon of pride has entered into us. So similarly, we find ourselves in a similar condition. Sri Ramakrishna says that all men are mad. One of the marks of madness is a scattered mind. A scattered mind. You know, if you cook, if you do Indian cooking, maybe you have to have a little box of mustard seeds in your spice cabinet. You take out that box of mustard seeds, sooner or later you're going to spill the whole box. Those mustard seeds, thousands will go all over the kitchen floor. You have to pick them up. Similarly, our minds are scattered. Patanjali Rishi tells us in the Yoga Sutra 4 or 5 different categories of the vrittis of the mind. The first one of which we're concerned this morning is called kshipta, that's scattered. Our mind is like those mustard seeds. One by one, where our attention is divided. We have to pick them up one by one to gather them together. That is the process of yoga and of the practice of beginning with pratyahara, that is gathering our attention, which is on 1,000 different things, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, just like picking up those mustard seeds one by one, putting them together in the box and bringing our minds into achieving one-pointed concentration. That's our goal. That's our purpose, is to achieve that state of one-pointed concentration. In Sanskrit, it's called samadhi. It's called super consciousness. And you don't have to think of it as some far-out mystical state. It's just the gathered mind. That is the focused mind. And that is, but certainly we're far from that condition. We're the opposite of that condition, of our ideal. And, well, another mark of madness. Sri Ramakrishna says all men are mad. Okay, what does he mean? Well, another mark of madness is that certainly our psyches are disordered. Disordered. I mean, if you went into a house and you were to see that the cats and the dogs and the children were just running wildly all around, and the parents maybe they were just permissive or maybe they were absent, we would say that that is a dysfunctional family. It's a disordered family. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Plato, in the Republic, spends a lot of time on this. That is, on ordering the psyche. He used to teach that we have a tripartite soul. That is, it's composed of the psyche, is composed of reason, that is what we would call the buddhi. And then it's composed also of emotions and feelings, which is the manas, and desires, the vasanas. But that our psyche that the harmonious psyche should be one in which there is hierarchy. That is to say, the buddhi should be in control of the manas. Our feelings, our emotions, our desires are not repressed. They're not dissociated. They're welcomed and are used for our energies and our mind. But who is in control? There is a controlling factor, and that is the buddhi, that is the wisdom, that is reason. Western philosophy is called reason. And this is what in the ordered, harmonious mind, the buddhi is the one which decides. In the disharmonious, dysfunctional mind is ruled by the manas. And the buddhi may indeed function, but it's held hostage by the manas. And so our thinking and our behavior is abnormal. What's a normal mind? A normal psyche? Well, the ideal, Plato, gives the analogy of the chariot. It's an ancient analogy. We read about it in the Bhagavad Gita, 2 verses. We read about it in the Katha Upanishad, 3rd chapter, where the body is compared to a chariot, and the horses to the senses, and the reins to the mind, and the charioteer, the buddhi, and to the rider in the chariot is the soul. And we know very well, we read the Bhagavad Gita, that's the image that Sri Krishna is giving spiritual teachings to the charioteer, that is Arjuna, who holds firmly the reins of the mind of the horses as he's listening to the high-minded teaching of Sri Krishna. We can contrast that with our mind, that is the mind of the ordinary person, where the buddhi is not in control. The horses are running wild. The reins are dragging on the ground. There's no great high philosophical discourse going on. There's just confusion and dust swirling around and madness. So that's a helpful analogy for ourselves, for our ideal of mental health and psychic harmony. It's the balance of the psyche, get control over the waves, over the reins of the mind. Sri Ramakrishna says all men are mad, another mark of madness. Certainly it is a mark of madness that we are, that we don't, that is, a person who is mad is a person who doesn't know who he is. If a person was confused about his own identity, Swami Vivekananda gave a lecture entitled "The Real and the Apparent Man," almost as if there are two people, two aspects to our mind and heart: the real and the apparent man. Now, these two are dissociated. And we can imagine a state of an actor on the stage. Maybe he's acting the part of Hamlet. But the actor, there's something awry with his, wrong with his letters. He loses discrimination. And he comes to believe that he is indeed Hamlet. And when the play is over with, and everyone is, everything has come back to ordinary life, he still thinks that he's Hamlet. He's still identified with it. Oh, we'd say, well, certainly he is mad. How is it possible? How is it possible? That is to say, from a third-person point of view, it is clear to reason that there is a difference between a flesh and blood real person and a fictional character. Between an actor in the 20th century and a prince in the 16th century. We think it's been impossible for us to confuse these two. They're clearly distinct, and yet somehow, through Maya, the impossible becomes possible. And we ourselves forget our true nature. The actor forgets that he is his real nature. Becomes identified with the apparent man, with the persona. Not only does he forget his true nature, but he gets caught up in the storyline, in the plot. And he becomes part of the melodrama. And he begins to pursue happiness and acquisition in the storyline. And the story goes on, and life after life, until he's caught in the great wheel of transmigration. So this is the plight of the jiva. This is our plight. This is our condition. And the Vedanta philosophy has a great enlightening, inspirational teachings for us to hear and to learn. But we cannot appreciate those teachings until we begin to accept and understand our problem. You can't understand the answer until you understand and appreciate. That is, you can't appreciate the answer to a problem unless you can understand the depths of the problem and identify the problem. And so in this way, the king, in our opening, the old legend, the king instructed them to look in the mirror. So also we can look in the mirror. We ask these questions: who am I? What does this all mean? What is the purpose? And the answers we may not get from the mirror, but what we need, Vedanta teaches us, we need to look in the mirror of that is to say, the Vedanta darshana, the Vedanta Darpana, that is the mirror of the scriptures. And when we look in that mirror, then we can begin to understand what is the problem. And we get to understand what is the cause of the problem. And we become to understand then what is the solution to the problem. And how then we can appreciate what we need to do to begin to take steps forward to returning to our mental sanity and to begin to live in accord with the truth.
Swami? Amen. Next week our speaker will be Swami Satyamayananda, and his topic is the Upanishads' secret knowledge. Classes are continuing. Tuesday afternoons at 4:30, Narada's Way of Divine Love with Swami Sarvadevananda. Tuesday evenings at 7:30, Shanti Gita with Swami Sarvadevananda. Wednesday evening 7:30, Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna with Swami Sarvadevananda or Swami Satyamayananda or Swami Atmatattvananda. Thursdays at 7:30, Bhagavad Gita with Swami Satyamayananda. Saturday mornings, meditation class at 10 a.m. with Swami Satyamayananda. I mean, those are our main classes. Thank you to Swami Vedarupananda for his enjoyable talk. The Swami stays at Swami Vivekananda House in South Pasadena and comes here nearly once a month for a talk. So we always enjoy his stories.
Om Dyo Shanti Antariksha Shanti Prithvi Shanti Apa Shanti Oshadaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishwe Deva Shanti Brahma Shanti Saravam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Same Shantirehi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all.